Hi, I'm Melissa Gismondi, and welcome to our second edition of BookStory. BookStory is a book club for history lovers. It's brought to you by BackStory, an American history podcast, and Delancey Place. Delancey Place is your home for eclectic excerpts from works of history delivered to your inbox daily. And today I'm very excited to introduce Joanne Freeman, who's the editor of this month's book selection, The Essential Hamilton: Letters and Other Writings. Joanne should be familiar to many of you who are fans of BackStory. She's a host there. Joanne is also a professor of history and American studies as well at Yale University. And she's author of the book Affairs of Honor: National Politics in the Early Republic, which won the Best Book Award from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. I should say as well that Joanne is an incredibly popular figure on social media and in traditional media as well. And she's become the world-renowned expert on Alexander Hamilton, who, in case you haven't heard, has become something of a national celebrity in the past couple years, thanks to the smash Broadway hit musical. And the creator of musical has also credited, the creator Lin-Manuel Miranda has also credited Joanne's work as having a big influence on his vision of Hamilton and the musical. So thanks for being here, Joanne.
Oh, sure. It's my pleasure.
So I guess just to start, talking about the book, tell us how the book came to be, and especially I know you did an earlier version of some edited letters of Alexander Hamilton in 2001. So how did the essential Hamilton come to be?
Okay, well, you are right that I did an earlier, bigger version of Hamilton's papers for the Library of America. And what's wonderful about them is that they put great American letters and literature in print and then just leave it in print forever. So to me, as a historian, I was like, Hamilton's letters in print, woo! They'll always be out there. So that's been out there for a while, but particularly because of what you were just saying, so many people now are so interested in Hamilton and in this time period. I thought, well, people might not all want to look at an 800-page collection of Hamilton's letters, but if I do a shorter collection that has letters that I think are either very important or writings that I think are really revealing, and if I put introductory material in there so that it's user-friendly, and even put a little bit of a guide to how do you read 18th century letters, then more people would be invited to come and look at this stuff while there's an audience for it. I mean, as long as people want to read primary documents from the 18th century, I'm there. I'm delivering.
Well, so you said a couple things actually in there that I want to unpack. The first is, I guess, and I'm sure, this is, a lot of people are wondering this, why the interest in Alexander Hamilton now? So we know that there's the musical, but it's clear that there's something about Hamilton and his story that's speaking to Americans. And I think it's particularly interesting as well because in your introductory essay, some of your commentary throughout the book, you talk about how Hamilton is kind of a difficult person to like. He's moody, he's a bit extreme with his political views sometimes. And then he also as well, right, has this famous phrase where he talks about how this American world isn't for him. But we love him right now. So do you have a sense of why that is?
Wow. Okay. I guess part of the answer to that, I'll start with this and then I'll back up.
Okay.
Part of the answer to that is the person who we love right now is mostly Hamilton, but not all of Hamilton, right? I mean, and that makes sense because most people have been introduced to Hamilton through the musical. The musical is a musical. So there's no reason why it needs to go into great detail about Hamilton's politics, which are problematic at times, or, as you were saying, the more problematic parts of his personality, because he had issues. He definitely had issues, and he could be a hard guy to get along with, which is part of why he's so interesting to study. So none of that has to be in a musical, but what that means is, and I guess this is also part of what inspired me to do this book, is that people are interested in the period and are excited about this guy who, yes, did come from the Caribbean with nothing, did, through his talents, sort of make himself into someone did do a lot of things very quickly at a very young age, and of course then died really dramatically in a duel. So he is that guy, and that's a great story, right? And it's full of pathos, and it's full of drama, and it's full of tragedy, and so it really works well for theater too. So I mean, there are a lot of reasons why his story is appealing. I think right now, maybe partly, it's because to have a sort of immigrant story, of an immigrant sort of, and also kind of an American success story, that maybe people are moving in that direction, because at a time when we're a little bit adrift as to where we are as a nation, that might be appealing or comforting to people. So I think part of the reason has to be grounded in where we are now. And part of it has to be because it's a really good story and people just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm. So what's one, and I guess this kind of links up to my next question that I wanted to talk to you about, which is how you decided, this is essentially a curated collection of Hamilton's letters. And so how you decided which ones had to be in there, which ones you wanted in there. And, and with regards to that as well, were you trying to address aspects of Hamilton that you think people would be surprised to know?
Okay, so I don't know if you can hear these sirens rushing by outside.
This is live streaming. That's what it's all about, right?
So, go on, get by. Okay. So how did I pick what's in the book? Was your question? What was the reason? I mean, it was a combination of things, and it's partly things that if you want to understand why he's important, you need to know. So there's got to be some Federalist essays in there. There's got to be some of his more famous pamphlets in there. So there need to be some of his great writings, some of his newspaper essays. Those are the things that he was doing that made him a public figure. But also there are things in there that make him human. So I was partly looking for letters that do that make him real. And in some ways make him real in ways that people who see the play would go, oh yeah, I kind of remember that, because there actually are letters in here that you'll hear them reflected in the play. There's actually a reasonable amount of real stuff from the 18th century, real letters, dialogue from the 18th century in the play. And some of that people will recognize in letters in the book. The other reason I put some things in here is because I don't want him, well, I guess I have accomplished this based on what you've already said. I don't want him to just be this glossy, glowing founder on a pedestal. I want him to be problematic. I want the unpleasant parts of his politics to be visible as well. And so some of that is in here too. And then a couple things that I just think are ridiculous and funny, and I can't do a volume like this without putting them in there because they're goofy and human and human. They make him real.
Mm-hmm. Which seems so important, right, as you were saying, especially because I think there's a tendency among most of us to hold people in the past up to some sort of pedestal, but to understand that they're complex people with different and sometimes changing ideas as well, right? From when they're younger to when they're older.
Absolutely. And that's particularly true with the founders, right? Because of all the people that we put on pedestals from the past, those are like the highest pedestals in a way, are the founders, capital F. So particularly as someone who teaches about that a lot, I know and have experienced how hard it can be to get people past the sort of important guys in a room writing pieces of paper down on the ground with real people who don't know what they're doing and who sometimes make stupid mistakes. And that's far more accurate a story than the sort of pedestal founders that I think probably some people learn very early on in school, and it kind of sticks with them.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. Well, there's lots more that I want to unpack from what you just said, but another thing I noticed you said in the introductory essay, so you talk about, and this is, I think, the essay where you talk to us about how to read these letters. So can you tell us a little bit, and you're very clear to kind of think about where Hamilton was, what he was doing. Why did you want to include those sorts of guidelines in the text?
I have to say, I'm proud of that. Like, I was very pleased that when I asked, can I include this? They're like, sure. It's like, yay. It is something I use in my classes. I teach one class called The Age of Hamilton and Jefferson that's taught entirely with their correspondence. Mm-hmm. And this is a version of, I think I called it in my class, A Quick and Dirty Guide to Reading Other People's Mail. But it's the same idea, which is a sort of intro course or intro page into how do you look at an 18th century letter, because not only is it a letter and you're trying to figure something out, but it's an 18th century one, which has kind of weird conventions. But the other part of that is, and I think this gets back to founder capital F, it's easy to forget that this is a real person who had something to say and sat down at a desk with a pen and wrote it, right? And that when you're looking at these, anyone who wrote a letter wrote that letter for a reason, was maybe sitting at their desk, was maybe out in the middle of a coffee house, was maybe on the road, maybe had it sent in the mail, in which case they didn't think it was very important, maybe made sure that someone delivered it to somebody's hand, in which case something important might be in it. So again, there's like a ground level reality of the person at the desk writing a letter and leaving clues as to what he or she wanted to say or meant to say or didn't say. And then the other kinds of clues just in the actual document itself that tell you what the people who were reading and writing these letters were thinking. I don't think people, these are 18th century documents. They don't sound like the most exciting things in the world to me. Obviously, they're profoundly exciting because they're real, right? They're the real person. That's what, when I first got interested in Hamilton, that's what sucked me in, were his letters. That's what I thought, oh my gosh, it's like a real person. And I was a kid, I should say. I was 14.
Wow.
I know. I was an insane 14-year-old. I stumbled across Hamilton. This is the bicentennial. And I started reading founder biographies and got to Hamilton and stopped. And a friendly librarian directed me to his papers. And there's 27 volumes of his papers. And I pulled down the first volume and I just started reading. And that to me was much more interesting than the biographies because it was a real person. And you had to figure out the mystery. And at the time, nobody really knew, not like now, who he was. There weren't lots of biographies. There were very limited numbers. So I kind of felt like, oh, this is a really interesting guy. This is a very strange life. And here are all of the things he wrote. I'm just going to read these. So that's, in a way, the experience that I want anyone who looks at these letters to have some part of, which is, oh, I'm getting to know how this person thinks and I'm getting to know this person.
So was that did that drive your motivation to include several letters to his wife, Elizabeth?
Sure. Many moons ago, when people used to publish, the public papers of, I don't know, George Washington, they would always be public papers, meaning my report on this, my memo on that, my letter to my secretary. But usually, or very often at least, not in those collections, are letters to and from friends or family or loved ones. And those letters aren't always, but can be just as much a part of the politics that's going on in any given moment. So sort of public and private division doesn't work when you're trying to figure someone out through his or her letters. And so that's part of it. And also, again, that, I keep coming back to this idea that I want so badly for people to understand these people as people. If they don't have families and they don't have wives or husbands or kids or issues that seem trivial but are exceedingly human, they won't seem human. It's part of the experience of being there in that time period, and it's part of what shaped the worlds of the people who were there and their ideas as well as their actions.
Right. So you get not just Hamilton, but then you see kind of the cast of characters in his world and his networks. And what you were just saying as well reminded me of the short little letter to his daughter with advice on what to do to make sure that she pleases people and what to do if she doesn't.
Right. Letters to kids are I think, always are pseudo surprising when you're looking at a public figure. So the letters, there's one I think in there to his son and one in there to his daughter. Mm-hmm. And it is nice to see that human side and worried about, do you want to come home for Christmas, son? That sort of letter. Again, you don't expect to see it there, but it shows you a person negotiating their public and their private life.
Do you think that understanding people in the past, and particularly, maybe complicated figures like Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson. Do you think that understanding them as people helps us kind of empathize as well with their situation, the decisions that they had to make, the choices that they were working with?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the very quick and dirty version of my first book, Affairs of Honor, is that to understand the politics of the period, you have to understand how people thought and what they assumed about what they should or shouldn't be doing as politicians and gentlemen. So those are things that seem cultural and they seem personal, but of course they're going to shape what you say when you stand up in Congress, what you feel you can and can't do as a public figure or politician. So yeah, I think that sort of thing, I think culture of all kinds, it sounds like I'm going to say this and people are going to say, duh. But I mean, I think culture shapes politics and it shapes it in broad and narrow ways. And I think it's important to remember that. And again, the human angle is one way to do that. Now I have to ask, because I have no idea about the technology that we're using here. And I saw something flitter across the screen and I don't know what it said. And I don't want to leave somebody out. And it said something about burning. I wonder if it's about burning correspondence.
Let me check. This is
live. It's really live. Someone asked a question that will kill me not to answer their question.
The play, okay, I got it. So this is from Blanche.
Hi, Blanche.
And Blanche asks, the play implies Eliza burned letters, removing from the narrative. Thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. Excellent question. Yes. I mean, she did, and she's not the only one, but she did destroy or remove or do something to many of her letters to Hamilton. Many of the letters that survive between them are really the Hamilton end of that correspondence. She's not the only one. There were other wives of important people who did the same thing. People knew after a certain point that these guys were founder-ish and that people would probably be wanting to read what they wrote. So if you were the wife of one of these people, you probably wouldn't want to think that the public someday might be looking at your correspondence. So many women did some version of that. So that's part of why we don't have a lot of her letters to him. What's interesting is in her later life, there was just this big auction of Hamilton correspondence at Sotheby's, I think in January. And there was a whole bunch of her correspondence there, all from later in life. But that was really intriguing for me to see, you know, talking to her kids. Right after the duel, there are some of her letters in which she's trying to figure out what to do with her sons, like to apprentice them or put them somewhere, or, you know, she's trying to figure her life out. But as far as her letters to him, she pretty much took care of those.
So that is a great question. Is that why you think we don't have as good a sense of her? I mean, we hear about other founders' wives, like obviously Abigail Adams or Martha Washington. Is that why we don't know much about her?
Well, you know, Abigail Adams is actually the big exception to a lot of rules about elite women in this period, because she was pretty much a politician. You know, she was very much, along with John, asserting her thoughts, putting herself in, you know, political venues and asserting her opinions. And even at the time, some people kind of kiddingly said things like, you know, she's a better politician than her husband. So she was very present in a way that isn't necessarily that common among elite women. But Elizabeth, yeah, I think related to the question, she's kind of silent. She doesn't have to be, and that's another one of the things that the play does so well, and then I guess Ron Chernow's biography did too, is kind of restore the fact that she's there and that she did all this work. You know, she lived decades beyond him and spent a lot of those decades trying to collect all of his letters, trying to get people to write a history, a biography of him, like trying to preserve his life and importance. So even though in that case, her voice is partly linked to his by choice on her part, I think it's good, and I think it's going to be increasingly the case that her voice, as much as we can reconstruct it will be there. I mean, I know there are books out there brewing about Schuyler's sisters and Angelica and Elizabeth Schuyler, Hamilton. And so I'm sure there's going to be more to come.
And I wanted to go back to something you said a little bit earlier that I think is so interesting, because this is where you get the real, I think, detective interpretation work of what it means to be a historian. And so you say, you know, when Hamilton was writing these letters, what he didn't say, and trying to keep in mind and think about if he's not talking about something, why and what that means. Tell us a little bit about why that's important, and really what, you know, if there are some themes in Hamilton's letters that you are surprised to find relatively absent in certain periods.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm sitting here going through the index card file in my brain, trying to come up with a letter that I can point to and say, you'd think he'd say this there, and he doesn't. And the problem with that with Hamilton, of course, is he always says what he shouldn't say. So he does tend to cross that line in ways that he shouldn't. So he does not have a very good filter as far as filtering things out. But even so, you know, you look at a letter like there's a letter in this volume from, I think, May 23rd, 1792 to Edward Carrington, really long letter. And Hamilton writes this letter. I use this in my classes. Hamilton writes this letter and sends it to a Virginian, Edward Carrington. And it's like a little book, you know, it's like, I shall now tell you my view of the state of parties in America for 40 pages, you know, and he goes on and on and on. And he's describing his relationship with Madison and Jefferson. It's, you know, pretty close to what we can get from him as to what he wants people to think of that fight. But of course, what's interesting is, and this gets back to the detective work, you have to ask yourself, he's a guy sitting down and then writing a 40-page letter. Why? You know, why is he doing that? Well, if you think about some of the questions at the beginning of the volume, number one, what's happening in 1792? Oh gosh, political partisanship is really heating up big time. And just before this letter was sent, you have newspapers beginning to clash. And so you certainly have him wanting to weigh in. But even more than that, if you think about who he sent it to and the fact that this guy is a Virginian, and you do a little more digging and you discover this Virginian knows George Washington. Part of what Hamilton might be doing there is writing something out, kind of thinking it's going to come back around through Virginians, maybe to Washington, in a way that he couldn't communicate this on his own. So, I mean, again, that's my happy little theory, and there are many other theories I could offer as far as that letter goes, but it's a great example of the kind of detective work that helps decode why somebody, and particularly in that case, would write a 40-page letter, right? That's got a purpose. It's got a big purpose.
A long letter, right? And as you say as well, a paper, I think in the introduction, paper's expensive back then. It's a long time to sit down and write a 40-page letter.
Yeah.
It's a serious undertaking. Another letter that I found really interesting as well, which I hope you can talk to us about, is the one to John Jay during the Revolution, when Alexander Hamilton, you know, because of course I think it's so discussions of what the founders thought about big issues of the day, like slavery and race. And in this letter, Hamilton is saying, we need to arm African Americans. We need to get them on their side. And I think it comes just a couple years after in Virginia, Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which said Lord Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia, and it said to enslaved African Americans, if you come join our side, we'll give you your freedom. And Hamilton points out that they're going to do that if we don't do this. Right. Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, that letter and Hamilton's views on slavery and race at the time?
It's a really interesting letter. I mean, he doesn't say a lot about race and slavery in those 27 volumes. This is very directly addressed. Now, again, it's with a purpose. So in this case, his buddy John Laurens wants to have, every time you start talking about Hamilton, like lyrics come into your head. A black battalion.
You can break out into song if you want.
People aren't going to want that. But, his friend John Laurens wanted to have a battalion, a black battalion, black troops. And he asked Hamilton to try and get support for that plan. So the letter to John Jay is Hamilton saying, my friend has this idea, can you promote it? Now, what's interesting about that letter, and you're right, Hamilton in that letter partly is being practical, which is, well, come on, we need soldiers. The other side might do some version of this, and we can offer them freedom for this. So what's not to like? What's interesting about the letter is that, and I haven't looked at it in a long time, I think, and I can't recall now. I don't know what kind of footnotes are here. Footnotes, good, they're footnotes. So in the letter, he makes a correction at some point. So he says something like, well, these people may be our equal. And then he stops and he crosses it out and he says, these people probably are our equal. Wow. Which is fascinating, right? Because he's wrestling with it maybe partly for himself, wrestling with it maybe partly because he wants to persuade John Jay. But for whatever reason, that's a really interesting kind of a edit. Again, history detective work, but really fascinating. Now, he clearly was anti-slavery. He belonged to the New York Manumission Society. But when you look at what he did when he was immersed in a cause, he was immersed in a cause. I mean, it was everywhere. So while he was an active member of the Manumission Society, it doesn't come across in his papers as a sort of major purpose. So I wouldn't call him an abolitionist because I don't think he was saying we need to immediately abolish slavery. Hamilton is, the law and order guy. So among other things, that would not seem as though it's going to promote law and order. But he was definitely anti-slavery, and he definitely aligned himself with other people who were doing what they could do to work against it and to work around it, to educate people, to do things that could fix the situation in some way as it moved its way towards becoming better.
So why do you think, I know this is speculation, what's your sense of why it's not more in his letters? Is that he's in this world with Washington who, owns slaves and many others, and he's trying to maintain some, good relations with these guys? What do you think it is?
You mean why he doesn't talk about slavery more?
More, exactly. And then, like you said, it's when he's in a cause, and it's clear that he has this passion about many things. But that seemed to be something, based on what you're saying, that was more private for him, and it didn't appear in his letters.
Which is why I don't think it was a driving passion for him.
Right.
It's precisely for that reason. Now, maybe someday, there'll be this cache of letters that'll be like the hidden slavery letters of Hamilton that will totally revise our thinking. That would be fascinating, and I'll be the first in line. Be like, show me the letters. But as they stand now, the fact that there isn't much there suggests that was not something that occupied a lot of his time and a lot of his thought. Mm. He was on the right side of things. He was working with the people on the right side of things. But it wasn't in the foreground for him that often, I guess I would say. Now, I saw Blanche appear again.
Yes, no, I was going to, Blanche wanted to ask as well.
You're teaching me about this, so thank you very much.
So Blanche is an AP history teacher.
Oh, yay.
As are many of BookStory listeners and hopefully soon BookStory Club members. And so Blanche was asking about how she says she's having struggle and difficulty getting students to connect with primary sources. And this can be difficult, right? Especially the language is different. It's a totally different way of writing sometimes. Do you have any tips for teachers and educators out there?
Sure. Now, first, I have to say, yay, AP history. I'm a product of public schools and AP history. So, you guys, right? Yay. As far as tips for using the letters, it's true that they can be challenging. I do use full letters. I don't like collections of things that pull paragraphs out of letters because they do the exact opposite of what I'm all about, right? Mm-hmm. It isn't then anything except a random paragraph of text, whereas a letter is an actual event done in time. So I do use the full letters. I guess part of what I do, one of the things I tell my students to do as they're reading is to trust their gut. And by that I mean, so actually the Edward Carrington letter that I mentioned, the 40-page whatever letter, it's a long letter. So I tell my students, okay, so to figure out what's going on here, see what it feels like when you're reading it and trust your gut. What does your gut tell you it feels like? Now, normally people read that letter and they come into class vaguely embarrassed and they say, it kind of sounds like high school. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Well, Hamilton basically says, well, Madison liked me first and then Jefferson came and took him away. Well, that is indeed a lot of what the letter says. And it does show you how personal that is. So that's like right on. But it's something that I think students don't always feel that they should be following that kind of an instinct, because it doesn't seem like, I am not thinking about republicanism. I am not talking about the roots of democracy. But in interpreting primary documents, that kind of a gut instinct is important. So that's certainly one thing I would say, is to ask students what something feels like. Read it out loud and ask them, does it sound like this person is happy? Does it sound like this person is not happy? Does this make you, laugh? And even if the students respond in a way that's not intended in the letter, that's still the entry into the letter as a way of a person expressing thoughts and feelings. So no matter what happens with that kind of a question, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, no, and it definitely, like you were saying, it just confirms that they're people, right? And I think it also forces us to kind of reassess. When we are reading a letter from Alexander Hamilton, we might be expecting him to be talking all about government and politics, but sometimes he's talking about his friendships and his feelings and his emotions about all of those things.
Right.
And that's just as important, and as you said earlier, can really have an influence on his politics as well, right?
Right. For everybody, right? Who you are as a person affects what you do personally and politically. And so you have to understand the culture of a period and the people in the period to get a full sense of the logic of what's going on.
So I have one question I wanted to ask you. So as you said, you started reading about Hamilton when you were 14. Is there a question that you would love to ask Alexander Hamilton?
Ooh, oh my gosh. I have never thought about that. Wow. That is a good question. Question that I would like to ask him. Well, I think I don't necessarily have the specific question, but I would have to sit down and talk with him about the duel. Right? Because I'm a scholar of dueling and honor culture. I've written about that duel a lot and dueling in the period a lot. So I understand the logic of it. Even that said, it's so hard to crawl inside the head of someone and understand that moment of decision. That's, I think, what I would want to do would be to get a sort of honest, I'm not writing a statement for posterity. I'm not talking to friends I need to impress, but you, invisible person, voice coming out of the blue, I'm just going to tell you the logic of this. That would be fascinating. And that would decode this really alien foreign thing that's fascinating, but that remains, I think, hard for many people to understand. Many people just assume, well, he must have been suicidal because why else would you fight a duel? Well, the problem with that logic is hundreds of people were fighting duels and they were not all suicidal. And in a letter of his, he talks about how not to defend national honor is political suicide. So there's an opposite logic there that doesn't work. But I think that's what I would ask him about. So in the recent past, when I've been doing all this Hamilton talking, sometimes people ask me if I would ask him about the Reynolds Affair, but he can keep that to himself. I don't need to ask about that. I want to know about the duel.
Well, tell people a brief little snippet for those who don't know what the Reynolds Affair is. I think most people know Hamilton died in a duel with Aaron Burr, but tell us just briefly what the Reynolds Affair was.
Good catch. The Reynolds Affair, so Hamilton had an adulterous affair with a woman when his wife and their kids were out of town. Years later, there were some pieces of paper that emerged that suggested somehow that he was doing something illicit with government funds. And he stepped forward and said, no, I'm not doing anything with government funds. I was paying blackmail payments because I committed adultery. And then, to prove that this was really the case, he wrote a pamphlet, the Reynolds pamphlet, in which he publishes all the correspondence. He has an appendix in the back with documents to prove things. He really, really is saying, I'm a trustworthy public servant. and an adulterer, but a trustworthy public servant. And so the pamphlet is wild and scandalous, and not a lot of people did something like that at that particular moment. So it certainly made a lot of attention, and it did not serve his reputation very well, although it didn't destroy it. But it's the whole Reynolds issue is really more than anything else about committing adultery and then confessing to it so that you're not considered guilty of what he considered to be a worse crime.
Right, which is, I think, kind of difficult for us to kind of wrap our heads around, that he would not only confess in public, but provide evidence for it.
I know, exactly. There was a kind of pamphlet in this period that people who were studying France already had it in their books, but people studying America hadn't. In my first book, I call it a defense pamphlet. And that's this kind of pamphlet that has an argument and then backs it up almost in a lawyerly kind of a way with like document A, document B, document C. And so for sure, in a lawyerly kind of a way, that's what he was doing.
Well, so, you just published this edited collection of Hamilton. Tell us what people can look forward to from you in the future. What, if you're working on another book as well, right? Tell us about that. I'm
working on 2 books because I'm bonkers. So the next book that's coming out is going to come out sometime probably in the late spring, that I've been working on for 16 years. Things in history don't happen quickly. That has become more timely over time. That's on physical violence in the U.S. Congress in the first half of the 19th century and the Civil War, the coming of the Civil War. So the short version of it is I uncovered lots of physical violence in the House and Senate, fistfights, guns, knives, things that had been, pseudo-censored out of the record. So that book allows me to say, I found these really cool things, and let's look at what these things people haven't seen before actually mean. So that's book number 1. But then book number 2, oddly enough, although I've written a bazillion pamphlets and essays and things about Hamilton, I haven't written a book, not a collection of letters, but a book. So what I want to do after this book coming out in the spring, which I should say is titled The Field of Blood, which is a phrase from the time period for Congress, I'm going to write a book about Hamilton. It's going to be, to me, kind of an intro book to Hamilton. At some point, I want to write a big biography, but in this case, what I want to do is, not unlike, in a way, some of what I hint at the beginning of this volume. I want to show people how to get a sense of who he is. And so right now, the way I'm considering the book, and I'm at the very beginning of it, is I'm going to look at 6 different aspects of his personality or life, and I'm going to link each one with an important person in his life, and then show how you can figure out him and his life by looking at that thing. So, for example, I'm going to look at his relations with women by looking at his relationship with Angelica Schuyler. And that relationship is fascinating. Many people know it anyway. But what if you really look at it in the time period? What does that show you about Hamilton and women? So I'll be able to look at some interesting, bigger things, but I'll also be able to get down on the ground with the real people. And having worked on this for so long, I just have so much random, wonderful, quirky stuff in my head that this will be kind of the first time I get to commit it to paper. So that's the kind of book it's going to be. It's going to be a sort of exploratory, who was Hamilton and what can we kind of tell about him when we start looking at who he was?
Well, that sounds really interesting. Both of them sound really great. And I just want to thank you as well for joining us today, and Blanche as well for her questions. And so stay tuned for our upcoming announcement of July's book selection. And thanks again to our sponsor, Delancey Place. To receive your daily history excerpt, visit delanceyplace.org and sign up for their daily newsletter. You can also purchase next month's selection through their website, and all profits will support children's literary projects. Happy reading, everyone, and see you soon.